Ever tried reading while jogging, cooking, or even juggling flaming torches? Yeah, it doesn't end well. But with audiobooks.com, you can conquer books without the circus act. Dive into over 450,000 titles, including more than 10,000 free ones. Get hooked on a bestseller, find your next obsession, or finally read that classic you've been avoiding since high school. And here's the inside scoop. Sign up today for a free 30-day trial and snag your first 3 audiobooks on the house. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.
Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana, where finally we don't have a time limit, so we're going to make a 3-hour show.
Oh, God.
Can you imagine? No.
No.
But my name is Patrick, and with me, as always, is my hostess with the mostest, Mackenzie.
Ew.
Yay! So today we have a little bit more of a low-key episode. It's mostly going to be lit-based, right? And yeah, just a kind of brief moment in time. But it does kind of set the scene, I think, in an interesting way for developments in Canadian literature, and unbeknownst to the people at the time who were participating in this literary moment, future Canadian politics. So yeah, it's not a useless episode in the grand scheme of whatever canon we're creating on this episode, on this show.
Mm-hmm.
But before we get into that, a bit of admin, because we'll get the boring stuff out of the way first. So, a few things. We like to highlight people who send in reviews or comments on the show, and we got a couple since we last spoke. Some of them we got directly on Spotify. We got 2 from Flora. I'm not going to say your full name, just in case. But Flora, who first of all said, one, she likes that we dropped the Historia Canadiana part of the show, because it's more direct to say a cultural history of Canada. So duly noted. And also sending us love for the interviews that I do sometimes on the show. So thank you again, Flora. Your message was well received and appreciated. So if you want to actually give some reviews or support us over on Patreon or any of that stuff, feel free. We have some more interviews coming up, or I'm trying to set some up. Some interviews that actually promise to be quite interesting. Actually, I don't know if you've been following the email chain, Mac, but there's some that promise to be kind of cool. So stay tuned for those. And yeah, you'll have early access to those interviews or these episodes or the extra show that we do, anything over on Patreon, right? So all of that good stuff.
We talk about beavers.
Yay! We have to come up with our next insane topic for PopCat. All right. So Mackenzie, today we're talking about modernism. Modernism in Canada. Yay!
We love modernism. Everything stinks. Everything is awful.
But also kind of cool sometimes, like artistically cool.
Oh yeah, artistically great. Suffering's great for the soul.
Exactly. Suffering has never produced such great art as when modernism hit. That's my hot take on art. Right there. Art peaked with modernism.
Art. Oh God. The postmodernists are coming for us.
Fuck them. They're wrong.
Michael and Dachi's gonna come and hunt you down.
No, like all jokes aside. So I wanted to not only talk about modernism as a concept, in part because it does relate a bit to the last episode we did. Some people I think do make that relation between realism and modernism maybe that they're like two sides of the same coin or one is an extension of the other, but they are related as far as like literary movements of the early 20th century are concerned. And I specifically want to talk about modernism through the lens of a small group of poets that emerged at McGill University, right? Which I think is kind of cool, right? Oh, there is something I wanted to mention, just because our show, bless you, our show tends to be like very past focused, at least for now, right? I do want to mention something because we are talking about McGill, right? And I have a platform to actually talk about current events when I think they're interesting, right? Have you been following what's happening at McGill University recently from Australia?
I know that there's been the protests asking for McGill to divest investment from any, what was it, Israel affiliated. But I also know there's been like some demands to remove profs. There's been all sorts of stuff going on.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, it's kind of, I was like unexpectedly related to what's happening over there. A partner and I, a peer and I from the University of Montreal were actually supposed to present at the biggest Canadian social sciences conference at McGill University, which is technically happening right now, right? But because McGill as an institution, it has not been doing what people have been asking of them from their students or their teachers, basically the core body of people who are participating in the institution. They're not being listened to. And so basically a series of panels and aspects of that major conference, which obviously brings a lot of attention to universities when they're hosted at their place, were canceled, right?
Right.
People saying F you basically to McGill. And I just had to highlight that because I kind of appreciate the moral stand that a lot of academics are taking on this particular thing, because it's very, and I was wondering that too, like where I was going to position myself, because as someone who's early in his career, it's kind of hard to like not participate in these things because I need it to build a CV and be a part of that world, right? But at the same time, I strongly do not encourage institutions to literally invest in genocide in this case, or not pay their teachers appropriately.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was a weird one, but ultimately my partner and I decided to drop out of the conference, and then the entire conference was canceled. So I guess, yeah, screw you, McGill. So that's what's happening in modern McGill. I don't know if you have anything to add on that. I don't know, but I just wanted to mention that because I think it's really interesting and might be of interest for some people who listen to this show.
No,
yeah,
it's interesting to think about, and it's interesting. Like I find it's an interesting thing to see, and we're really starting to see things just going crazy. You know, like people are really starting to stand up for what they think it's supposed to be.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's especially interesting because McGill is not exactly known for its protesting culture. Like when you think university protests in Quebec, you don't think McGill first. You think like UQAM or Concordia. Yeah, exactly. Like
I think
those
it's
two.
Partially based on the issue, because you can't deny that the history of McGill has a very long tradition with the Jewish community in Montreal. Like it's a long history there. Yep. So obviously this is going to be something that's really going to come knocking at McGill's door.
Absolutely. Yeah. For those of you who don't know what Mac is referring to, McGill has a history of discrimination against Jewish people. I mean, again, I'm sure a lot of institutions do, but because of McGill's age, it was easier for them to do that.
No, but it's also like McGill's has a lot of history gets discrimination, but also like the people who have paid for a lot of McGill as well.
Yes, that too. Yes.
Like, but the Jewish community in McGill go hand in hand investment wise and everything.
Yes, that too. That too.
Like, because Montreal has a rather large Jewish community, and I had a lot of friends in that community, and
sure,
their families had gone to McGill, their family's family has gone to McGill. Like, it was just the accepted norm. So with what's been going on in the world, it was bound to blow up.
Yeah, I'm surprised it took this long, to be honest, but I'm glad it's happening, because I think a lot of people need to face the reality of their actions or the consequences of their actions, even though like what we're doing here is not nearly enough to actually change anything, 3,000 kilometers away, right? Obviously, it's like one very small drop in the bucket, but I think it is worthwhile work to do, right? And is demonstrative of how much, some of the people in Canada are in favor of, these types of movements.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Anyway, that's all. I just wanted to highlight that because might as well do it now.
Yeah. Well. Yeah.
That's it. Show's over, folks.
I mean, I don't know. What else is there to say?
Yeah, no, that's it.
Happy that people are making their voices heard.
Absolutely. So today, getting on to like the actual show, right? Mac, do you want to start us off by kind of delving into what we understand by modernism, right? And how it perhaps differs from what we were talking about last week in realism, which kind of emerged at the same time.
Yeah. So there is some overlap between modernism and realism for sure. Both sort of arose in that like late 19th, early 20th century. Yep. Modernism much more concerned with the earliest 20th century.
For sure.
But modernism is sort of, it very much leans into the dark and foreboding atmosphere. And it is denoted for its style as well.
Yes.
Especially in its prose. The most commonly thing that we'll hear is stream of consciousness. Which, God, how do you explain the stream of consciousness?
Okay. It's, how when you think, you don't necessarily take breaks at logical places. Your thoughts just kind of go from one random place to another and make random, connections that make sense technically to you, but not necessarily to anyone else. That's kind of what stream of consciousness reads like. There's technically a thought process there, but it's a bit harder to discern because it's meant to parallel how humans think, which is not always logical.
Yes.
A perfect example of that.
Well, that's the biggest demarcation between realism and modernism. Is modernism, in the space of the novel at least.
Yes. Yeah.
Is the use of the stream of consciousness, because modernist novels, while genuinely wonderful things to read, are absolutely crazy.
If any one of our audience has ever read like some of the later Virginia Woolf, Heart of Darkness, yeah, definitely. Heart of Darkness, I feel, is like low-key modernism. It's not like as full tilt as modernism would ever go.
Or anything by what's his name? Henry.
Henry James.
Turn of the Screw. Yeah, Henry James.
Is it Henry James? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Turn of the Screw and all that sort of stuff.
James Joyce. My boy.
Some Kafka.
Yep.
Our boy Kafka. For those of you that have seen Bridget Stone's Diary.
Yay. Yeah. So very much, but I think you bring up a really interesting point in style is like, if you want to take it out more generally, right? Modernism as a movement, whether it applies to novels or paintings or poetry, as we'll be talking about it today, is concerned with pointing to breaking down the expected norms of these certain styles, right? Like this, if we take if we look at like the history of literature, for example, say to come back to the novel, despite these different periods of romanticism and realism and all of that, the novel, while it would have thematically approached different ideas, right, or different subjects, would have still followed a similar structure, right, for most of these periods and most of these ideas. Modernism provides a clear break with that and says your structure is what we're specifically attacking, or the way that you understand how the structure works is what we're specifically attacking. So yeah, that's kind of how you can think about it. And same thing for painting. That's when you get much more abstract art, is during modernism, right? Or when you get things like futurism or Bauhaus, things that don't necessarily make sense on a first glance, right? But that once you start to parse out the internal logic of the work of art, then it starts to make sense, even if it's rather incoherent for some people. Yeah. I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. No, okay. It does. I get you.
Yeah. How would you define modernist poetry, though? Like, what is it about poetry that makes it modernist?
Oh boy. I mean, because the modernist poem is going to be The Wasteland, right? T.S. Eliot's
The Wasteland. Or Pound. Ezra Pound was a huge modernist.
And it's mostly just like, it's very experiential. Say. Like it's much like, because poetry before that, it had experiences, it had emotions, but they were more like this feeling of the sublime, the surreal. Whereas now the feeling is introspective, dread, pondering, like all that sort of stuff. And it's also it's when poetry started to really play with its form over its content.
Yeah. Like the meter wouldn't necessarily be consistent, again, to come back to that term, where if you look at
we really start to see free verse come into its own.
Free verse. Yeah. Very much. Not necessarily paying attention to rhymes.
Rhyme structure and line structure and meter and verse and all that sort of stuff. Free verse is those poems of like, it's probably the stereotype you think of when you hear poetry.
Yep, exactly. Just words smashed together that don't necessarily make sense. Probably a modernist poem. Or even, like you were saying, technically it could have a form, but it's a weird form, like making shapes out of poetry is very exactly. Yeah. What's her name who did a lot of that? Stein. Gertrude Stein, I think, did a lot of that, didn't she? Yeah. Millie Dickinson, I think, did a little bit of that as well, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, very introspective stuff, which is perfect for interwar periods.
I love the interwar periods.
Yeah, exactly. When you're constantly contemplating your existence, because that's all there is to do. All right. So I don't know. Did you have anything to add on like modernism as a concept?
Sorry?
Did you have anything else to add as like on modernism as a concept before we dive into the Montreal group?
Yeah, we sort of, again, like we're giving poetry and novel examples. We probably still have some film examples from today that you can probably call as modernism. Maybe more like in
probably.
the 70s. Sort of had its modernist movement.
Yeah, but there was even in the 20s and 30s, like in the early days of film, you could argue that there was some modernist shit in there. They were doing some weird stuff with film in like the early days, and like the surrealist movement and all of that.
So when people are talking about modern literature, they don't mean modernism from the 21st century. They mean modernism from like the 20s and 30s.
No. Yes, that we should have specified that. When we say modern, we don't mean contemporary. So 20s and 30s was very much the early days of modernism. Yeah, it continued arguably until like the 50s. Yeah.
Or, modern comics, as in like the Dark Knight Returns, Watchmen,
Yep. Yep. But no one cares about comic books, Mac. They're for
Yeah.
children.
They're not real cinema. What?
Yeah, but that's actually the example of Ezra Pound is actually a good one. Have you ever read Timothy Findley's famous last words?
No.
No, it's really good. It takes place in like World War II, and it follows a character called Hugh. Oh shit, Hugh Mauberley. Um, and what's interesting is that Mauberley is also a character in Ezra Pound, right? He's kind of Ezra Pound's um, version of himself that he puts into poetry to put it in that particular way. So Pound would be the modernist in this case, whereas if people want to compare it to postmodernism, postmodernism would be Findley's references to the modernist Pound in a different set of literary works while still making it new. Right? This is a reference that like 3 people in the audience are gonna get, but whatever. we'll make it work.
There you
go. Okay, so I wanted to address modernism in Canada, which would have its moment. It would probably see its most popular iteration in a novel that came out in the mid 50s, which is called The Double Hook. I don't know if you've ever read that one.
Possibly.
By oh damn, I'm blanking on her name off the top of my head. I'll think of it in the middle of the episode. It doesn't matter. Sheila Watson. Sheila Watson's The Double Hook is probably like the epitome of modernism in Canada, and arguably the transition into postmodernism. But it did surprisingly, as a movement, as a literary movement, start off pretty much on par with the other North American poets and literary figures in America, right? So in the 1920s and 30s, there were people who were starting off in modernism, and they were students at McGill, right? Students who wanted to change things up, right? And wanted to get away from what they saw as like the turgid and stuffy Canadian poetry, which we've talked a lot about on this show. Right? And probably is the poetry that made you hate poetry.
Yeah.
Right. So you'd get along with a lot of these modernists who are like, fuck this. This sucks. This is boring. But basically, there's no one version of what has come to be known as the Montreal group, which are these McGill students who wanted to like encourage modernism in poetry in Canada. Because as you might expect from student publications, they would basically try and fail to produce like 4 versions of their movement. And the last one is probably the most successful one. And it's the most successful probably because right after all of those poets became successful in their own right. Right. And so they kind of remembered the last iteration of their attempt. So what I wanted to do was kind of go through the phases briefly of that poetry movement of the Montreal group, and we can kind of talk about some of their poems at the very end. Right? And kind of read some if you want. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool.
I can dig it.
So basically, the core group that we can talk about of the Montreal group included poets like A.J.M. Smith, F.R. Scott, John Glasgow, A.M. Klein, Leo Kennedy, and Leon Edel. Edel? I assume Edel. I don't know. Most of these names, like half of them, I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily remember today. But I'll encourage people to at least keep 3 of them in mind because they have kind of become mainstays in Canadian literature. Right? So A.M. Klein is probably one of the better known, if not the better known writers in this group. He is one of those Jewish writers, and part of that Jewish diaspora that you were talking about, Mac. He's very much, a figurehead of early Jewish Canadian literature. He wrote The Second Scroll and a poem that is called The Rocking Chair, which is kind of like a very well-known one in Canadian poetry. And the two others that I'll ask people to keep in mind is A.J.M. Smith, who was a very well-recognized poet during his lifetime, and F.R. Scott, who you would actually appreciate, Mac, as a fellow Bishop attendee. So, yeah, he also went to Bishop's in Lennoxville, the college. Yeah. And he later...
Lennoxville, baby!
Woot woot. But Scott is actually interesting because he would live a life outside of poetry. He would actually, and this is why we'll focus a whole episode or dedicate a whole episode to him in the future, he'd actually be one of the creators of what became known as the NDP in Canada. He was someone who was very politically active and would found the CCF or co-found the CCF, which later became the New Democratic Party here in Canada. So technically an important figure. That's kind of cool. So their first phase, if you want, was very short-lived. It lasted 18 issues and lasted from like 1924 to 1925, right? And it was known as the Literary Supplement. This was purely founded by Smith, right? He was really the forefather in this case. And he brought in many of these other poets to contribute. And unfortunately, I couldn't find any like digitized archives of the Literary Supplement. If some exist, I'd love to see them. But from what I understood, based on my research of this particular phase, right, is a phase where they were very much trying to find their voice, right? Just throwing things at the wall and seeing what worked, right? It's the experimental phase of the Montreal group, finding their poetic voices. It's their college phase, if you will. But it is kind of interesting because a lot of these students, they're undergraduates at this stage, right? Or early graduates. So they're still very young. They would have been in their 20s mostly. And they are, I think, very much primed for pushing Canadian literature in a new direction, right? Perhaps as a result of their age. But yeah, one of the reasons why the supplement failed, right, which doesn't surprise me. Why would you think the supplement failed, Mac, as a first endeavor for poetry? Why do you think it would only survive 18 issues?
Because here's the thing. If you make a poetry periodical, whatever, pushing back against the business and, people with money, you don't get money. And if you don't have money, you can't keep doing your periodical.
That is absolutely one of them. That is a genuine concern for all poets out there. Where the fuck am I going to pay for this? But also, funny enough, it was considered by a lot of people to be a little bit too highbrow, a little bit too elitist for a lot of people's taste. They were like, oh, we're the better ones, so we're going to show you how poetry is done. Like, that's how a lot of people perceived.
Got called too elite.
Exactly.
Fucking love that one.
And so they kind of folded
and
decided
art.
to.
I love people involved in art. They're all like, art is full of some of the greatest geniuses of our time. It's also full of the biggest dumbasses you'll ever meet.
Yeah. It's so great. But I kind of appreciate that, where the whole point of this group is to make poetry new, but at the same time, a big part, I think, of the modernist ideal is to be accessible and to represent what the average person is seeing, right? The modernist ideal, and you can maybe disagree with me on that, I don't know, but I think aims to make poetry and art for the masses, right? It's not meant to be highbrow for a lot of people, right? Yeah. So I think they were trying to find that ability to make aesthetic products while still being for the masses. And I think their willingness to say
the
that
aesthetic.
always the capital A aesthetics. But we're going to transition now into the what's it called? The ASMR version of the show. But yeah, I do appreciate that kind of willingness to make it for the masses, even though they, self-avowedly failed at doing so in their first iteration.
It's just, this really does. This truly is a group of McGill students. This truly is a group of art students thinking they will represent the masses. Like, as somebody who was in the English department at Concordia and all that, like, my God, it's the real thing.
Which is very, again, it kind of fits in with what we're saying now about McGill today, like literally what we were talking about with Palestine. There is an irony to the fact that these students are often quite well-to-do and don't have much to complain about. And again, that's not to say that they're wrong because of it at all, but the irony is quite funny.
Well, it's the irony of all artists, because any like of the great artists of time ever are weird freaking people, and they're not like people that are easily accessible.
No.
Like, obviously there are exceptions, but on the whole, they're just generally just strange outliers. And then they're like, oh, but I speak for the common person. I'm like, you're not the common person.
Yeah. But again, I do want to credit modernism where it is, like, you do see figures like the German playwright Bertolt Brecht, who did try, like, he genuinely did want to create theater that was simultaneously pushing boundaries and making political statements for the masses. He had like his own political views on what he wanted to push as ideas. But I do think you see more in modernism than in any other poetry movement before that attempt to find that balance in a genuine and like really thought out way, right? On a theoretical level, if you want to put it that way. No less ironic, but I do appreciate them for trying. Yeah. So second iteration of the Montreal group did last a little bit longer. It lasted 2 years instead of just one. So good for them on that one. And it wasn't called the Literary Supplement this time. It was called the McGill Fortnightly Review, which does not sound any less elitist if I'm going to give like some editorial notes on this one. Calling your journal the McGill Fortnightly Review does not sound like something the masses are going to read. But that's just me. So they did declare themselves to be like an independent journal of literature. The Arts and Student Affairs, edited and published by a group of undergraduates at McGill University. That's how they kind of announced themselves. But they were funded by the student body nonetheless. So they yes, like
funding from the masses.
I mean, yeah, kind of, right? So they weren't, I guess you can say they weren't technically independent, but hey, again, you got to make your money somehow. Right? So this goes to show just like how much of an inflated sense of ego some of these people had. One of the contributing editors, Leon Edel, described the magazine as, quote, representing the innovative spirit of 1920s in Canada, right? So apparently just trying to channel the spirit of the age in Canada in your little graduate journal at McGill.
The age of Spock radios and flappers, when all the peoples were going out to the film theaters.
But also rampant poverty. And the death of poetry.
Don't worry about the poverty, kids. Just snort your third line of cocaine.
Yeah, that's true. Cocaine or
laudanum. Go grab the opioids, kiddos.
This episode is
Remember,
brought to you in
kids,
part by
in
Laudanum.
Flanders Fields, the poppies grow.
Oh, god damn it. The true modernist classic.
Well, you know what we use poppies for, right?
Yep, I mean, yeah. The
Drugs.
fucking terrible. Yep. But basically, what is interesting is that Smith, who was the founder of the first one, while still encouraging contributions from all over the place, like students from whatever background were encouraged to submit, there was still editorial control that was imposed by people like Smith or Scott, and they were very much expecting a high quality of poetry. How they define that, of course, in a modernist sense, can be subject to interpretation by the very definition of modernism. But it does show that they took this journal seriously, right? And they didn't just want to put out whatever in the hopes that it worked. They did actually want to produce a quality journal, and took their mission as quote unquote embodying the spirit of the 20s, right? Seriously. Right? And again, that's something that a lot of student journals, right, don't necessarily achieve in doing, or at least achieve in doing for any length of time. So I, again, wanted just to commend them on that one. But what's kind of cool about this particular journal is that on top of actually producing poetry, they did also start to produce editorials and reviews of texts, right? So it's in the pages of the McGill Fortnightly Review that they start to analyze texts that had just come out or recently come out at the time, like The Wasteland that you were talking about earlier. And that you start to see overt editorial attacks against what the editorial group of the time called the Maple Leaf School, right, which were the Confederation poets, which we've talked about before. So actively thinking about what as a group they represented poetically, right? Which, again, cool. But of course, and this is one of the poems that you read, it's within the pages of the McGill Fortnightly Review that one of the better known poems from F.R. Scott was published. And this is the one that you read called The Canadian Authors Meet. And this is probably one of Scott's most anthologized poems, right? And probably one of the ones that he's...
This poem is so famous, I've read it.
Oh, okay. We've actually found... Holy crap.
The last time we had this was the Sunshine Sketches of a Small Town.
Mm-hmm. It was. This is incredible. Wow. Okay.
Yeah,
do you want to do us the honor of reading the poem out loud? Or at least some of it?
Sure. Well, it's not very long.
Yeah.
Expansive puppets percolate self-unction beneath a portrait of the Prince of Wales. Miss Crotchet's muse has somewhat failed to function, yet she's a poetess, beaming she sails. From group to chattering group with such a dear Victorian saintliness, as is her fashion, greeting the other unknowns with a cheer, virgins of 60 who still write of passion. The air is heavy with Canadian topics, and Carmen, Lampman, Roberts, Campbell, Scott are measured for their faith in philanthropics, their zeal for God and King, their earnest thought. The cakes are sweet, but sweeter is the feeling that one is mixing with the literati. It warms the old and melts the most congealing. Really, it is a most delightful party. Shall we go around the mulberry bush, or shall we gather at the river? Or shall we appoint a poet laureate this fall? Or shall we have another cup of tea? O Canada, O Canada, O can a day go by without new authors springing to paint the native maple and to plan more ways to self the self-same welkin ringing?
Fire. Absolute fire.
Banger. Confirmed banger.
So, do you remember like why this particular poem would have been written and in what context? Like what is he talking about in this poem? Do you remember?
Well, it's pretty obvious. He's kind of railing against the current organized poet fashion.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
more specific, like he's very much like, again, he's railing against the crown beneath the portrait of the Prince of Wales, like all this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Institutions, the act of sitting around and discussing instead of doing.
Yes. And I think this is like
basically
a perfect example.
This is the like it's the poetic version of young people talking about rock and roll to old people. That's not real music. Listen to this, man.
I mean, pretty much. But I think, with the same like tongue-in-cheek nature, I think Scott is developing his satirical abilities, which would very much come across in some of his later poems. He would really go in on the satire on some of his later ones, and I think his references to like that second to last stanza, right? Shall we go round the mulberry bush, or shall we gather at the river, or shall we appoint a poet laureate this fall, or have another cup of tea, right? He's just like tongue in cheek, very much pointing to the absurdities that a lot of these poets are representing by trying to channel their voice and how stupid they sound by just focusing on trifles rather than any kind of artistic merit as he would have seen it. Right. But yeah, I still like this poem. Came out like the original came out like 27 or 26 or 27. I'm not saying it,
but I'm just like, it reminds me of, any new age alt movement or whatever,
Yeah. I wonder. I really don't know, because I don't know the intention behind the poem. I wonder if part of that is what he was trying to like channel, is that kind of voice that was actively trying to imitate a like son or a son going up against his father or something like that. I don't know if that's what he was trying to do.
Maybe not son versus father, but it is past versus future.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You can say it in that sense. Yeah. Definitely. Yeah.
Again, like, shall we go around the mulberry bush is very much I can't remember the name of it, but it's very much like a targeted call at a certain piece of text, isn't it? The mulberry bush one.
You might be right. I can't remember for the life of me either. But I'm sure you're correct.
Yeah. Here we go. Yeah. Mulberry. Because it's okay, so yes, it's a nursery rhyme.
Oh, okay. That's not what I was thinking of, but I
think the idea is, again, it's an English nursery rhyme.
Yeah, that'll do it.
And I think that's the big thing, is the easiest way to push back against the institution in Canada is to push back against the crown.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, definitely. So yeah, that's despite like the McGill Fortnightly Review being quite important in like bringing modernism to Canadians' attentions, or at least like the Montreal scene's attention. Mm-hmm. The Canadian Authors Meet is probably the poem that stands out or stands the test of time in that period of the journal and of the group, right? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of poetically what we can say about it. The third phase, not super interesting either, compared to the second and fourth. They restarted the journal under a new name called the Canadian Mercury, and this one was entirely subsidized by one of the former staff members of the Fortnightly called Louis Schwartz. So again, like a consistent stream, but it didn't particularly last long either. It lasted for only 6 months, because what happened in 1929? The great crash.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's happened. The stock market has crashed. Sell your stocks and bonds now, because everything is worthless. Remember, little Johnny, if you want to wear the latest fashion, it's a potato sack.
Oh God. So try as they might, they wouldn't have necessarily gone very far because everything sucked for like the next 10 years. So they they still had the same group of editorial people working on it. Although what you start to notice by the end of phase three, by the end of the Canadian Mercury, is like people are starting to graduate, or at least the core editorial group are like graduating or heading to other places in Canada or even in the world. So actually keeping any kind of editorial coherence is getting increasingly hard, especially in the 1920s when you can't communicate through Zoom. So that kind of falls apart very quickly. But we want to, and I want to end today, or at least spend the last part of the show with the fourth part, which is really the moment when a lot of like literary historians identify modernism as settling into Canada, right? Or like fully taking root in Canada, or at least in some way, shape, or form. And that's with the publication of a text called New Provinces, Poems by Several Authors in 1936. Right? Basically, this text is an anthology of poems that had been collected from throughout the Montreal group's scattered career, right? While also bringing in new voices in the modernist poetry movement. And to give you a sense of like how important this book is, I looked it up while researching the show. It easily goes, like an original copy of this book easily goes for $100, if not more. I saw a copy for like $750 because it was signed by one of the lesser poets of the collection. So this is an important text. And it's interesting to talk about it because it also demonstrates the conflicting visions or editorial visions that people had vis-a-vis what this collection should be, right? Mostly coming from antagonism between A.J.M. Smith and F.R. Scott. Basically, everyone agreed that they wanted to illustrate the advances of the early Canadian modernists in terms of technique and subject and poetic perspective. And it contains, I think, like 40 poems in total, right? Most of them by the original editors of Leo Kennedy, Klein, Smith, and Scott, but also some newer voices like E.J. Pratt or Robert Finch. And what's kind of cool is that, well, kind of cool, not really.
You know what's really cool? Poetry.
It's not really cool. I guess. But what's kind of interesting is that Smith had written an original preface for the anthology once it was ready, or once it is coming together. And that preface, which is not a sentence that you hear many people say very often, but that preface would actually be the subject of quite a bit of editorial controversy. And it ended up being cut from the original edition, right? Because basically, Smith spends most of the preface shit-talking other poets that came before them. It's just like, I actually have a version of it here. Hold on, let me find it. It literally starts, because in the 1976 reedition of this book, they republished the rejected preface. And it starts off in the very first paragraph. The bulk of Canadian verse is romantic in conception and conventional in form. Its two great themes are nature and love, nature humanized, endowed with feeling and made sentimental, love idealized, sanctified, and inflated. Its characteristic type is the lyric. Its rhythms are definite, mechanic, and obvious, and its rhymes are commonplace. He just starts off swinging of like, y'all are basic.
Yeah.
It's basically what.
Y'all be bitches.
And I have to admire that. Again, good on you, Smith, for basically antagonizing most of the people that you would be encountering in the poetic scene. But Scott, as a co-editor, wanted the preface to be a little bit more of a historical statement on the development of the contributor's poetry, and basically make it less antagonistic. And ultimately, Scott would win out. And the original 1936 version of the anthology basically features like a very shortened 2-page preface that was hastily written by Scott before it was put to print.
Yeah.
And it's only in the 70s that the original preface surfaced. But despite this, there were some other disagreements, for example, about who to include. Scott really didn't want, for some reason, to have fellow poet Dorothy Livesay included in the anthology because he didn't think that she would fit. But that's not to say that they had like any major disagreements. From what I understood, he just didn't think that her voice would be particularly coherent with the rest of it. But who's to say? Like, so basically, it seems like it's mostly Scott's project, from what I can gather, because his ideas are mostly the ones that made it onto the page, as far as like an editorial vision is concerned. But regardless, the work came out, I think, in a really interesting way. And if you'll indulge, do you want to read a few of them from the?
Read me a poem, Patrick. Read me a poem.
I'd written in the notes like, hey, let's read like one of each. We've already been talking for like an hour at this point, so maybe not. But
read me a poem. Any poem.
Okay, hold on. Let me actually find the damn poems. Unless you have one open that you can share.
Nope.
Already. Cool.
I want you to read me a poem, Patrick.
Fine.
Sweep me
but
off
the
my
damn
feet
thing
with your poetic ability.
Okay. I was wondering why it wasn't working, and it's because my archive borrowing had ended. Okay. So this one is one of the first poems. This is by Finch in this case. And this is called Become That Village. Become that village where a world in small prevents my poverty, a common to community, beyond the seas of access hurled, in those ungeometric streets whose lights no system may predict. House me so nothing shall evict my hope and its defeats, which villains for their mannered lords will feed on unmolested game, asking no honor but his name, with silence their exact reward, silence before a silent tree to tabulate the mocking brief, unconscious transit of a leaf, the curt migration of the bee. And that's it.
Cool.
Yeah, I like it. This one, I kind of like it less because it changes much in terms of format. But it does represent a lot of the thematic concerns that would affect a lot of modernist poets.
Thematic concerns.
Well, no, but it would like the sense of community, right? That the poet is calling for. No. I have to explain it to you, Mac. Let me mansplain it to you.
Oh God, yes, mansplain poetry to me.
The most masculine of things, poetry.
Mansplaining poetry.
That seems like a Monty Python sketch. All right. Do you want to read the next one? Anyone. Pick a card. Any card.
All right. So which one do you want me? New provinces?
Yeah, sort of new provinces. Just one from.
Yeah.
So I started off with.
I have to borrow for 1 hour.
Oh my God.
There we go. All right. Boop. Clicking randomly. This one's E.J. Pratt. There we go.
Okay. Cool.
The prize winner.
Nice.
Pure blood, domestic, guaranteed, soft-mannered, musical, and purr. The ribbon had declared the breed, gentility was in the fur. Such feline culture in the gads, no anger ever arched her back. What distance since those velvet pads departed from the leopard's track? And when I mused how time had thinned the jungle strange within the cells, how human hands had disciplined these prowling optic parallels, I saw the generations pass along the reflex of a spring. A bird had rustled in the grass. The tab had caught it on the wing. Behind the leap so furtive wild was such ignition in the gleam. I thought an Abyssinian child had cried out in the white throat's scream. It's about a cat. No, but like literally, it's just about a cat.
Oh, yeah.
It's about the domestication of like these apex hunters, turning them into cats, and what like again how that relates to us. Obviously, and over time we've domesticated ourselves. But I'm okay with being domesticated because that means I get video games. So.
But I don't know if it was just the way that you read it. But did you notice that there was a rougher like rhythm to the way that you were talking?
100%.
And I think that's
I mean, I played
so
it up, but it's also
modernist.
like just the way the use of the commas, for example, very simply they dot through pure-blooded domestic, guaranteed, soft-mannered, musical, and purr.
Yeah.
The ribbon had declared the breed, gentility was in the fur, and the fact that just the word choice as well, like we're ending with like a hard word like guaranteed.
Yeah.
Or you have those hard
exactly.
like guaranteed.
Yeah. Very much. Okay. Let's go with one last one here.
All right. Summer camp. Here's a lovely little camp built among the Laurentian hills by a children's welfare society, which is entirely supported by voluntary contributions. All summer long, underprivileged children scamper about, and it is astonishing how soon they look healthy and well. 2 weeks here in the sun and air, through the kindness of our wealthy citizens, will be a wonderful help to the little tots when they return for a winter in the slums.
That's it?
So it's essentially talking about, like, no, because there's a very good point there about how summer camps in their original purpose were done as a way to sort of, like, placate the poor people, and the wealthy could charitably let them go experience the Laurentians in sunlight, and then they'd have to go back to the city.
That's an FR Scott one, right? Yeah.
I don't know. I just picked a random middle place in the
book. I'm telling you. Yes. So again, you can very much see Scott's own politics permeating into a lot of his early poetry, and you can kind of see him sowing the seeds of his eventual like socialism or like social democratism.
Socialism.
But again, what I find stylistically interesting with this poem is like it almost looks like a found poem, right? Which for people who don't know, a found poem or found poetry is basically recreating poems from either conversations or from previously written texts or anything like that, right? And at least the way that you read it, it sounded like just a casual conversation or just something that you would say on the cuff, but that is absolutely set out in a way that fits more with the rhythm of poetry, even though the actual words on the page are not necessarily poetic. I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah.
No, it makes sense to me.
Okay, cool. I don't know what this episode was. I think it was just an interesting highlight.
Modernism, baby. We love it.
Yeah. I don't know. Do you have anything that you wanted to like mention or end on? I have some things that I could say as an ending, but just to give you more to say, is there anything that you want to say, like, as far as like the entry of modernism into Canada was concerned, or your final thoughts on modernism or student publications or anything like that?
I don't think so. I think there is a very large discussion to be had about student publications due to like how prevalent they have been in the past, but it's always going to be the push and pull of how much those student publications rely on the institution. They rely on themselves, the people, the masses, the money, the not, the this, the that.
Yep.
And I think this is a really good example of just how contradictory it can all really become.
Yeah, for sure. I do want to actually, I'll go off of that because there is like a surprisingly interesting history of very influential student publications in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I'm sure like across the world, but because this is a Canadian-centered podcast, why not? But like not only this one in particular was very influential as far as like bringing modernism, but one of the something that actually the conference I was supposed to give at McGill, the conference paper, was about another one of those student groups, but this time in the 60s in British Columbia, that were very much influenced by what was known like as the Black Mountain Group. And so they brought up a lot of American style poetry and what they call projective verse into Canada. But they were students in British Columbia. They were also undergraduates. And they became one of the most influential poetry groups as far as pushing Canadian poetics forward past what we're talking about today. So I don't want to discredit student publications at all. I think they absolutely are worthy of attention, even if they don't have much funding or if they don't have like wide circulation. I think a lot of the most interesting stuff is being done by students and young poets who want to break the mold as much as possible. Yeah. All right, Mac, take us away.
All right. Well, everybody, thanks for listening to another great, wonderful, sublime episode of A Cultural History of Canada, as we're now officially calling it, but it lives on as Historia Canadiana in my heart. As always, you can reach out with any comments, questions, or concerns on the Facebook page or by email. You can support the show through PayPal as a pay what you feel the show is worth, and through affiliate links in the recommended reading page we have set up. You can also find perks like extra and ad-free episodes on Patreon, but as always, this is optional, and this show will continue to remain free and independent, baby, just like a student publication. Parallels. Yayo. Me and F.R. Scott were the same.
Hell yeah. I actually have a collected works of F.R. Scott. He's great.
And one day we're all going to have collected works of Patrick, so it's going to be fine.
Oof.
But finally, if you want, just leave a review, spread the word. It would be greatly appreciated. Helps boost the show. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you the next time on A Cultural History of Canada. Cheers.
Cheers, everyone.
You love podcasts, the stories, the laughs, the unexpected turns. But when this episode ends, the silence starts. Not anymore. Audiobooks.com turns that silence into your next great adventure. With over 450,000 titles, from bestsellers to hidden gems, your love for listening just found its new best friend. And because you already know the joy of audio, we're giving you 3 free audiobooks to start your journey. Imagine your favorite podcast, now with unlimited episodes. That's audiobooks.com. Keep the story going. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. Because for podcast lovers like you, the end of an episode is just the beginning. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.